Welcome to the first installment of Deacon Randy's Biblical Studies. This first installment is how did the English Bible come into being? You might say, how did the King James version of the Bible come into being, and so on. And I will say that the sources that I used for this were several. One of the ones I enjoyed the most was a documentary produced by a man by the name of Lee Groberg, which was Fires of Faith. It's a three video documentary. You can easily Google this and watch it, and I highly recommend it. It gives you a real taste of what these early reformers had to go through to produce a Bible in English. This was blasphemy, actually, back in these days. The whole title was Fires of Faith, The Coming Forth of the King James Bible. I also used Fox's Book of Martyrs, History.com, and several of more theological works. The title is kind of a question that presents the problem of where exactly do you start? I decided that since this isn't a college course and you might not want to sit through the development of the Old and New Testament manuscripts, I would jump in pretty much after much of the canonization had already been accomplished. Now, along the way, we can't ignore the contribution of the Greek Septuagint. I've talked about this before. The 70 book translation into Greek dates back to the 3rd century BC because it allowed the translators who were doing this to work from a single source that was in better condition and easier to read. They only had to inspect the newer discoveries of manuscripts that were not available to the Septuagint translators and do the necessary updates. Greek was a language spoken by much of the world during this period of time and allowed a much larger audience to be able to hear and understand the Old Testament as we call it today. It should be noted that literacy was at a really low point at this time, and the printing press had not been invented. So pretty much most people, the only way they heard scriptures at all were being read in assemblies, and they were not able to read them for themselves. People would memorize them and such, and then quote them back, but sometimes their quoting of it was not always correct. So having that Septuagint was of great benefit. So in 392 A.D., Jerome made a translation of the entire Old and New Testaments that he called the Vulgate. Vulgate, we get the word vulgar from that, which means common, everyday. It's not in the connotation that we hear today when we talk about something being vulgar, like bad language or something like this. It just means common. And so he called it the Vulgate because it was in everyday Latin. Now, it's kind of hard for us to these days think of Latin ever being everyday Latin, but it was a spoken language for a long time. But this book also became a problem because then it wasn't a spoken language. Because after the fall of Rome, after everything else that went on, Latin fell into disfavor. Other languages developed and took over. Latin then became relegated only to the churches. And so people would go to church and they would read from the Bible in Latin. And because they were already doing Latin when they read it, the Mass or all of the ceremonies in the church would also be conducted in Latin. So this actually had the opposite effect of what Jerome was trying to achieve, the being able to make it available to the masses, so to speak. His motto was make knowledge of the scriptures your love. Live with these, meditate on them, make them the sole object of your knowledge and inquiries. And if you really want to study the life of someone who had a life of where it was spent doing that, studying scripture and such, study Jerome. That's all. That's pretty much all he did in his whole life. The Vulgate did not separate the individual books into chapters and verse, however. It read pretty much like any other book. It was a collection of books, but did not did not have individual separations within the books. And so this was a bit of a difficulty if you wanted to quote from it, because if I wanted to tell someone in the third part, third section of, or the deep into the last third of Matthew where something was, it would take them a little while to read around and get that. I couldn't give them a page number because everything was handwritten. Back in these days, there was no printing press yet, and so it made searching difficult. So in 1205, a cardinal by the name of Stephen Langton divided each of the books into chapters. Now this helped out a lot because then they could find and quote individual parts a whole lot easier. But it wasn't until and so in the 16th century, these chapter divisions were inserted into the manuscripts of the Greek New Testament. Roger de Stephanus later numbered the verses in the chapters, which were incorporated into the 1551 edition of the Greek New Testament and the 1571 edition of the Hebrew Bible. Now, interestingly, today they're kind of going into retro mode on this a little bit. There's a couple of publishing houses that are now producing versions of the Bible, more specifically the NIV, without chapter and verse divisions. If you have interest in that, I would recommend that you call up parts of that on the internet and look at it. You might find that that's a nice reading Bible for you. And as I've mentioned before, you should have a number of Bibles, a study Bible, research Bible, a reading Bible, and so on. And it might be a good one for you to just sit back, spend an hour or two just reading the Bible. A lot of times it's easier without those chapter and verse additions. So in any event, the other thing was that back when these original manuscripts were written and so on, not only did they not have chapter and verses, they didn't have punctuation, they didn't have spaces between words, they didn't have paragraph markers. It was all just run together. I have mentioned before about how parchment and things like this is leather. It's difficult to come by. It's expensive. They didn't want to waste it, so they crammed as much into it as you can. Now, quite actually, you can try that with English, and you'll find out you can still read it and everything, but it's just not as easy. All that, in any event, was added later. So we have a Hebrew Bible, we have a Latin Bible, we have a Greek Bible. We have people that speak other languages. What happens to them? Excuse me. In the 4th century, there was a translation into what is now an extinct language called Gothic, spoken by, the Goths. You've heard of them, Goths and Visigoths that invaded Europe. They were the ones that overthrew the Roman Empire and so on. There are some translated into European, Eastern European, and African languages, primarily Ethiopia and that area. And Bede, sometimes called the Venerable Bede, is rumored to have translated the Bible into Middle English. But since no copy survives, it's really not that useful to us. But John Wycliffe is considered to be the one that got the ball rolling for the Reformation. He produced a version in Middle English that has survived. However, the errors in the translation, coupled with his protest against the Catholic Church, resulted in his body being exhumed after he had died, and the church wanted to get back at him. The people wanted to get back at him. So they went and dug up his body because, as a Catholic, he had been buried in hallowed ground. So they dug up his body, burned his bones, tossed him into a river. They were they didn't like him. They thought he was a heretic. All of this thing about you can't challenge the way the church is set up, and there were a lot of errors in that translation. So this resulted in an edict that declared anyone caught with one of those translations would suffer the death penalty. So even carrying around one of those translations could have you put to death. So William Tyndale comes along, becomes the and starts the first English translation between 1526 and 1536. He produced a translation directly from the Greek and Hebrew and used manuscripts that had been compiled by Erasmus, who was a Dutch scholar recognized as being the greatest in the Northern Reformation and the creator of the Textus Receptus, which is translated received text, and a Greek translation of the New Testament. Tyndale made his wishes known that he wanted to do a translation into the English to the excuse me, and to the Bishop of London, and he said no. This is a hanging offense if you do this. So he goes off to what is now known as Belgium and starts working on his translation. However, somebody ratted him out, so to speak, and they betrayed him to the authorities. He was thrown in prison. He was there for a year while he was actually finishing his translations, all of the Old Testament and most of the New Testament. And at the end of the year, it was judged that he should die of strangulation and then be burned. His last words were that the King of England's eyes would be opened. After that, he was strangled. Then they burned his body, and then, tossed it into the river. He had finished the translation of the New Testament, but the Old Testament was only partly finished and was later finished by John Rogers and Miles Coverdale. So, part two, we're going to talk about John Rogers and Miles Coverdale and the contributions that they had. So I would recommend that you subscribe to my YouTube channel, which is Deacon Randy's Biblical Studies. And that way, as I add new videos to this, you'll be able to be notified that they're ready. So I will see you next in Volume 2.